Better tie my shoe before I trip and fall. About 8 years ago, I taught a class that people said you should never teach in church. I called it Christianity and Politics because in that election 8 years ago, I could sense the anxiety and potential divide in our very diverse congregation. And tonight I'm going to share the first lesson of that series with you because I think 8 years later, it's still appropriate to share. If you look on your coins or probably even your paper money, you'll find the Latin phrase e pluribus unum. And that means out of many, one. Now, I'm not sure if that refers to out of many people, one nation, or out of many states, one country, but whichever, it's not an original thought with the United States. In your lesson, I've quoted Jesus' prayer in John 17, which Sean stole from me Sunday. And in it, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. His arrest is imminent. These are among the last words he will say before his arrest. And it's some of the most profound and important because it forms the basis, really, of what we're trying to do in churches of Christ. He said, "My prayer is not for them alone, just for my disciples that are here, unfortunately, asleep in the garden around me. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." And in this prayer on the slide there, you can see that Jesus prays for three things. For himself, that he will be glorified. For his apostles, that he'll send out for their protection and holiness. And lastly, and from our perspective, maybe most importantly, he prays for us and the church's unity through the ages. Unfortunately, the worship hour, not just in our country, but in many places around the world and throughout history, can potentially be one of the most divided and divisive times during the week. Now, here in America, many churches don't face this kind of potential problem because the overwhelming majority of churches in Lee County or around the country are monocultures. In other words, everybody in that congregation is pretty much voting one way. You go to a church here locally or go to one around the country, and it will be made up of people who are voting one way or the other. And so to have a church in which you have many people thinking very diverse things politically, it's hard to be e pluribus unum sometimes. Tonight I want to talk about 3 congregations that are trying to do that in very, very difficult circumstances and how they have arrived at unity in circumstances that we've not even begun to think about. But I think it's worth noting. The first one is in Northern Ireland, in the little picturesque seaside community of Holywood. If you're looking on your map there in your lesson, I think it would be a number 3 on the map in that little place there. Northern Ireland is verdant, very forested, very pretty. It has a lot to commend it. This part of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and therein lies the problem. For 30 years, from the end of the 1960s until the 1998 peace accord, they had what the Irish euphemistically downplay and call the Troubles. The Troubles were a divide in the community of Northern Ireland between those who were mainly Protestants, who want to remain part of the United Kingdom, of what you and I would call Great Britain, and Roman Catholics, who understandably want their whole island united under one nation. Because of that great divide, there was violence for 30 years. And I'm not talking about just people throwing stones. I'm talking about bombings, assassinations, ambushes, killings, of civilians, soldiers, people on both sides, women, children. It was tremendously ugly. 3,600 people were killed in those 30 years. Nearly every family in Northern Ireland knew someone or had someone they could point to that had been a victim of the Troubles. And there was a great deal of hate on both sides. Into this hate steps a preacher, Jim McGuigan. Now, when I wrote this lesson in 2012, Jim was there in Northern Ireland. He's no longer there. He's back in Tennessee now. And I think that what he left behind still is a legacy of unity. But Jim wrote a book called The God Who Commands the Impossible. And one of those impossibles was a way to bring union between former Roman Catholics and former Protestants into one congregation. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how much people hated each other, and yet he did not want to convert people into separate congregations, and the former Roman Catholics go to church over there, and the former Protestants go to church over there. He felt it was important that they publicly show that they now were something new, children of God. And he was intent on doing the impossible and creating the unity that Jesus prayed about, the E pluribus unum. And that became immensely easier after 1998 when the peace accords were signed, and by and large, Northern Ireland has been peaceful ever since. There's still plenty of people with long memories, still deep divisions there if you want to pick at them, but the church in Holyrood, there in Northern Ireland, is committed to unity. Here is a city I've always wanted to visit, God's holy city of Jerusalem. Maybe someday I can go there. There are people here who've been there and tell me wonderful stories about it, and I can only imagine. But it is a picturesque place that is divided along ethnic lines. You see in your lesson that when I wrote this lesson in 2012, Jerusalem was 65% Jewish, 32% Muslim, and 2% Christian. And the hostility between Israelis and Palestinians has boiled over more than once, a number of times, for reasons that go back into history and aren't worth our time dwelling on. But because of that division, over 8,000 people have died just since the turn of the century in these clashes between these two peoples. And the hate that's engendered and the revenge, the inability to get along is a huge obstacle in conversion. In Jerusalem, you have, as you can see in your lesson, people who still try to present the gospel. One of them, the man on the screen in the lower right or the upper right in your lesson, is Joseph Shulam. Joseph was a converted Jew. He was baptized, I think Russ said, in 1963 or so when he was about 13, and he's grown to become a preacher there among his people. He used to have on the sign Church of Christ, but it has been so vandalized and defaced by Orthodox Jews that he calls it Nativia, which is Hebrew for the way of the Lord. And on his website, he puts that the goal of this school, this Nativia, is to build bridges of understanding between Israel and the nations, between Jews and Christians, through the restoration of the first century disciples of Yeshua. And you talk about hard ground to plow. Joseph Shulam is plowing that ground. His counterpart is Raji Stephan. You can see him in the upper left or in the middle. Back in 2012, he was assisted by a young man named Aziz Abu Sarah, who I think has moved on. But nevertheless, Raji Stephan is there, and he is a Palestinian Christian. For much of the time of violence, Raji is not allowed to go to his church in Jerusalem. He must stay in the nearby town of Bethlehem and preach to his people, who are pictured there having communion just like you do, or at least pre-COVID, during every Sunday. And Raji and Joseph would like to do more working together, but that is a dangerous thing for them to do. They try to bring people together. And at the bottom of your lesson, you can see from the Jerusalem Congregation's website, the group is a mixed fellowship with members from Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Russian, American, and Armenian backgrounds. We consider our citizenship to be in heaven and look forward to a kingdom of heaven. These people have not lost faith in the ability to be united, despite grave political differences, despite hostilities that endanger even their own lives in preaching a peaceful gospel. And yet they've managed to find a modicum of unity. And the last one, and perhaps the most unfamiliar, is in a faraway land called Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka used to be known years ago as Ceylon. It was considered a magical spice island, highly Buddhist island there off the coast of India. And even today, it is Colombo, its capital, is many parts of it a beautiful modern city. Given its Buddhist heritage, they have built a 35-story tower they call the Lotus Tower, which lights up like this every night. Beautiful place to be. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka is also made up of one major ethnic group and several smaller ones. And the smaller ones and the larger one endured a costly civil war for 26 years. And it wasn't just 3,600 like Northern Ireland or even 8,100 like Jerusalem. Somewhere nearly 100,000 people died on that island in this horrible civil war. It has taken, well, even in the 11 years since peace was declared, there are still deep scars among the people, among the land, among the society that they live in, and deep mistrust between people of different ethnicities and languages. And yet, the gentleman in the upper right, pictured a little younger 8 years ago in your lesson, is Saman Noatana. Saman Noatana is the preacher for the Kohuwala Church of Christ in Colombo. And their symbol is up there, there in the center, two doves. And he preaches to people regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their political beliefs, because he believes in something greater, something more precious, something more eternal. And they meet every Sunday in their various ethnicities, not in separate places, but in one place, undivided. That's a great inspiration to us, it seems to me. We should also be reminded that when Jesus came into this world, he came to a very deeply politically divided land. In 63 BC, the Romans, who had always wanted to make the Mediterranean their own private lake, had a few little spots they needed to finish up to make theirs. And one of them was the land you and I call Israel, that they would call Palestine. There was a civil war going on in the land, and the Romans came to help everybody achieve peace. And they stayed, and they became the overlords. And the Romans were very efficient masters. Their only concern, they really only had two concerns. One was how to keep the peace, and secondly, how to extract whatever amount of taxes they needed to extract. But they didn't want to be tax collectors themselves, so they would put that up for bid. You would have the opportunity, if you wanted to bid to be a Roman tax collector. That way, the Romans got their money up front, and it was up to you to get your money back with a little for yourself from the people. And so in the New Testament, you have one of those bidders. His name is Zacchaeus. He's called a chief tax collector. He's the fellow who would have dealt directly with the Romans. And he would have put in his bid and would have been given his territory, and they gave him very little direction. This is how much money you were supposed to raise, and whatever you get above that, good on you. And the people were kind of fuzzy about exactly how much tax was to be extracted. And so let's just say tax collectors had the leeway to be as unscrupulous as they chose to be, and therefore were very, very hated by the people. As I mentioned last week, by the time Jesus was born, there were still people old enough in living memory for them to remember when they were still an independent nation. And they hated people like Zacchaeus, who saw a business opportunity and took advantage of it. Zacchaeus would in turn hire individual tax collectors. We have one of those in the New Testament, Matthew. He's pictured there in the lower left. Matthew would have a specific booth in a specific place and would report to somebody like Zacchaeus, who had, like a spider, fingers in various things spread around. And Matthew was also a hated man because whereas Zacchaeus might not interact with the people as frequently, although they knew who he was, Matthew was there every day at his booth, by the gate, or by the road, or by the fishing dock, wherever he was, and extracting his bit of money. And he would get a salary, and depending on how scrupulous he was, he would pass along more or less of what he got to Zacchaeus. And you could see how this was kind of a racket all the way up. People hated tax collectors, and they were never so thunderstruck as when this man, who many claimed to be the Messiah, Jesus, didn't care. He would sit and eat with these people. He would interact with people who were on the other side of a very bitter political divide. Their allies on that side were called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were Jewish leaders, almost entirely based around the temple, who had decided that they were to be the protectors of the people. The best way to be the protectors of the people was to cooperate with the Romans, get along with them, kind of guide them. If you had to, point out to the Romans a few Jews that got out of hand that needed to be killed so that everybody else would be safe. They were very proud of their position, and yet they used it to also make a great deal of money for themselves. The Sadducees were the ones that were in charge of the money changers in the temple. See, if you went to the temple, there were a couple of rackets that went on that made Jesus so angry. The first, as I mentioned, were the money changers. The money that people had oftentimes had the picture of Caesar on it. And the Jewish priest would tell the people, you cannot put money that has the image of a godless man in the money box. You have to change out that money for local money, which will have something like a sheaf of wheat or maybe a lamb or something innocuous, but it cannot have this wicked person's image on it. And so conveniently located at the entrance to the temple were money-changing tables where you would turn in your Roman money and get local money for a fee. And so every time there was an exchange of money, the Sadducees were making a cut. And you could put your money in the box and have a clean conscience. The other thing that they did was have animal inspectors. In other words, you were supposed to bring a lamb without blemish or a goat or a cow to the temple to be sacrificed if you were a faithful Jew. And the Sadducees had inspectors who unfortunately would find out that most of the animals brought had a defect. But luckily, they had an animal just back here that you could have for the low, low price, whatever you want to fill in. These were the people that were collaborating with the Romans and taking advantage of them. As far as we know, no Sadducee was ever converted to Christianity. On the other side were entirely different kinds of people. They were the Pharisees. They weren't based in the temple. These were the rabbis and teachers out in each local community. They were there among the people, and despite the impression you get from the New Testament, obviously a righteous one, that these men had far exceeded their authority and the decisions they made about the law of God, the local people held them in high esteem. They thought of them as religious supermen because they had the time and the knowledge to follow over 400 different laws of God in the Old Testament and hundreds of other conclusions about the law that they were teaching. And the Pharisees were very anti-Roman, where the Sadducees were people who thought that they were doing the people a favor by befriending the Romans. The Pharisees did not like them at all. They were interested in following only God. And it is important to point out that some Pharisees were converted. Saul of Tarsus, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus. They're people that were attracted to Jesus. They were, many of them, sincere. Now, to their right, even more conservative than them, were the Zealots. The Zealots would have considered themselves Jewish patriots who were trying to figure out ways, obvious and subtle, to get rid of the Romans. They might make it difficult on people like Matthew, overturning his table, avoiding taxes, protesting, any number of things that they could figure out. And to the right of them were probably the most violent of all, the Sicarii. A sicar is a curved knife, which I've pictured there, and it would be hidden within the cloak of the Sicarii. You and I, in 2020, would call these men terrorists. And they would go through the crowded streets of Jerusalem, and if they brushed up against a Jewish collaborator, they would take that knife out and stab that person and put it back in and be among the crowd that would holler at what a terrible thing had happened. They saw nothing wrong with extreme violence. Into this political divide walks Jesus. And as Sean mentioned, again, stealing my point, as Sean mentioned Sunday, it is amazing that in the 12 disciples of Jesus, you have a former tax collector and a former zealot. Two men on complete opposite sides. And yet Jesus somehow manages to bridge that divide and create out of many one unit. Jesus told his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Jesus told his disciples to go into all the world, and they were going to encounter many situations where people were all mixed up. In other words, people that lived together, some liking each other, some hating each other, some with great deal of varying opinions. And yet Jesus expected them to go into all the world and make disciples. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 3, let's see if I've got this here. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith, for all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. It's interesting to me that when the church begins, excuse me, in the book of Acts, that the idea of taking upon oneself or being called, maybe even pejoratively, Christian, does not happen in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, all the Christians are Jewish Christians. There's nobody there but them. And even among them, in Acts chapter 6, they find a way to fuss with one another, the Greek-speaking Jews and the Hebrew-speaking Jews. When the gospel moves on out to Samaria and Philip preaches to them and those people accept the gospel and are baptized, they're not called Christians either because their churches are entirely Samaritan. When the Lord moves the Apostle Peter to miraculously get up and go do something he would never ever do and go to the home of a Gentile named Cornelius to share the gospel with him in the Roman capital city of Caesarea, the people in Caesarea are not called Christians. Now, not that they aren't, but that's not the name they're given yet. The only people in Caesarea are Roman Christians. It's not until you get to Acts chapter 11 where you have one of the largest cities in the empire, where there are people from every nation there who are Gentile and Jew and everything in between, that the people, I think, unironically, are called Christians for the first time. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but I think that there's something special about that name and special about why it doesn't happen until you get to Antioch. Now, when we think about our congregation, Gulf Coast Church of Christ, it is a rare and special congregation, whether you realize it or not. Not only do we have people from all over the country, from one end to the other, we have people of varying races, varying political opinions, people of various cultures, some from around the world. And the idea of e plurimus unum, out of many one, a true blended church, is a very rare thing. Currently, there are 11,965 congregations of Churches of Christ in America. And out of those, only 232, less than 2%, are listed as diverse. Now think about that. Less than 2%. Now, I'm not indicting all the others. I'm just saying that what we have here is something very rare and very special that I hope is never endangered. There are 3 scriptures I have listed in your lesson that I think are important for us to bear in mind as we go forward as a congregation, regardless of which candidate is finally inaugurated in January. Be completely humble and gentle, Paul writes in Ephesians 4. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort, not a little effort, not some effort, every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 12, just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Lastly, I want to share with you my favorite verse in the whole Bible, and that's found here in 1 John chapter 4. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And He has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. Do you have deep, deep political beliefs? Okay. Just recognize that regardless of what beliefs each of us have deeply held, that when we come together as a family, we're a family. Maybe the best analogy is like a family reunion. I can remember years ago in the early 60s when I was a little bitty boy going to the Caldwell family reunion in Inman, South Carolina, north of Spartanburg. And there were scads of people. I mean scads of people. You know, because great-granddaddy had like 8 or 9 kids, and they had, you know how family reunions can be back then. And inevitably, there would be those family members who, they were a little different. They weren't like my little nuclear family. And yet, they were family. And we all sat down together, we all ate together, and we all had a good time together. And when we come together as a family every Sunday or Wednesday, I hope that we will pause and remember that Jesus died for your brother and sister just as much as He died for you. Now, the rest of the lesson there shows the rest of the lessons in the series. And really, they're in chronological order based on Christian history. It tells you what happens each step of the way with believers. And the Christians have endured a great variety of political settings. If you're interested in this lesson series, you can contact the church office. It's on CD, and they've got handouts and things. You're welcome to it. But it's one that I thought was worth revisiting after yesterday. I didn't want to ignore yesterday, but I want to point us to eternity rather than to what is temporary. All right, well, last week we were continuing on, and I guess we'll continue on the last 10 minutes, continuing on in the story, the stories found in the Gospel of Luke, the first of which is about the birth of John the Baptist. And we had gotten to the point where Zechariah the priest had won the lottery, literally. He had been selected by lot for the one time in his life to go into the temple and light the incense and then come back out and give the blessing to the people. The Lord bless you and keep you. And yet, he goes in and is completely shocked to find an angel standing there saying, Zechariah, you and your wife, who are childless, are going to have a child, and you're going to name him John, and he is going to do great things for God. And Zechariah can't wrap his mind around that because he and Elizabeth both are, shall we say, very mature people, beyond childbearing years in her case. And Zechariah, understandably, says, I don't understand how that's possible. And because of his doubt, the angel says, as a sign, because of your unbelief, you won't be able to speak until this baby's born. And the people outside, all of whom are waiting for Zechariah to go in, do his thing, come back out, are wondering, what in the world is going on? What are we going to have to do? Send somebody in there to fetch him? This is kind of getting awkward. It says, finally, he came out. He could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. It must have been quite remarkable. As I mentioned last week, it had been 400 years since Malachi had ended the last few verses of the Old Testament, and the Lord had been apparently silent. And this was something different. This was something noteworthy. It said when his time of service, which only lasted, I think, 2 weeks, when his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant. I would have loved, no, I wouldn't have loved. I would be interested to know the conversation that he had with Elizabeth. Well, he couldn't have had a conversation. I would be interested to know how, if you can't talk, that's more than I want to know. Anyway, after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days, He has shown His favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. We talked about last week how for a childless couple, that would have been a disgrace. People would have looked at them as cursed by God, and that would have been their shame. And many rabbis taught that a man whose wife is barren has every legal right to divorce her. But Zechariah had never done that. And we can only assume he loved this woman very much. A great credit to him. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth. Now, Gabriel has already gone and appeared to Zechariah 6 months and 2 weeks or so later. He makes another visitation. And by the way, this is how the idea of the date of Christmas gets bandied about based on when Zechariah served and the 6 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy and then the 9 months of Mary's. Anyway, that's how they claim to figure it all out, much to my skepticism. Nevertheless, Gabriel went to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, up in the North Country, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. Now, you and I would think of this as engaged, and I guess in a sense she is engaged to him, but this sort of pledge was made between families. The kind of idea of romantic love where you fall in love with her and ask you to marry her, all that kind of thing, that's only about 400 years old or so. That's why Romeo and Juliet is such a scandalous thing in Shakespeare's time, because people don't do that. Fall in love and go against their family's wishes. Ooh, that was naughty stuff. But in their time, this was all about families, and these two families had pledged their children to be married. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." And understandably, Mary was greatly troubled at his words. This woman, most likely, we're talking about, I'm guessing, 16, 17 years old. We're talking about someone, I think, fairly young. In their time, just like in your great-grandmama's time, a person was grown by the time they were 16 or 17. They were grown people. But to us, she would have been a young person. Mary was troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. Angels don't stop by just every day. Don't be afraid, Mary. And this shows again how angels are not the sweet, cherubic little things that we picture them to be. Zechariah was terrified when he saw the angel. Mary is afraid of this angel. The shepherds who were there when Jesus is born will be afraid of what they see. The guards around Jesus' tomb will be terrified when they see angels. So whatever they are, however they appeared in this case, they were not just huggable little things. The angel told her, "You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and I'm going to tell you his name like I told Zechariah how to name his boy." Typically, the Jewish father would give the name on the day of the birth, but in both cases, Gabriel is saying, "I'm doing this instead of that." His name will be Jesus. He will be very great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over Israel forever. His kingdom will never end. That's a lot for a 17-year-old girl to wrap her mind around. How is she going to conceive? How is this child going to be the Son of the Most High? And how can he be a king forever? Is he going to live forever? There's so much here for her that must be confusing of what he is predicting. Jesus means Jehovah is salvation. And just to be clear, there were plenty of children named Jesus. In Hebrew, it would be Joshua. There were plenty of them named Joshua in this time. So it's not as if this name was unique, but it has great meaning here for Mary and for us. And he would come to be called the Messiah, the Anointed One of God. Now, Mary, and we'll end with this slide, Mary is just as puzzled as Zechariah. Zechariah at least can conceive, how do I put this delicately? Mechanically, how he will create a child. Mary, as a pledged virgin, how can this happen? I am a virgin. I do not understand. So her question is not so much doubt as just, I don't have a clue what you're talking about, how this could happen. The angel replied, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, so the baby to be born will be holy." That is, he will not be an illegitimate product of sin. He will be unique and holy. Very difficult, I'm sure, for her to understand.